Before there were astronauts, before there was air travel for the masses, there was a man who became a legend by doing the impossible. You think you know the story of Charles Lindbergh, but you don't know the silent terror, the strange visions, and the almost unbelievable truth of what happened inside that tiny, single-engine plane during the 33 hours that changed the world. The air was thick with the stink of gasoline and the damp chill of a Long Island spring morning. It was May 20th, 1927, and the Roosevelt Field hangar was a madhouse of reporters, gawkers, and police holding back the crush. All eyes were on a young man, a lanky, almost painfully shy 25-year-old with a steady gaze, named Charles Lindbergh. He was an anomaly, an outcast in this desperate high-stakes game. The world's most famous aviators, backed by millionaires and corporations, had all failed, some fatally, to claim the $25,000 prize offered by hotelier Raymond Orteg for the first non-stop flight between New York and Paris. The front-runners were seasoned WWI aces flying massive, multi-engine aircraft. Lindbergh, however, had arrived with a plane that looked like a toy compared to the behemoths of his competitors. It was a custom-built, high-wing monoplane called the Spirit of St. Louis, and it was deliberately designed with a critical, terrifying flaw. It had no forward-facing windshield. To fit the massive single fuel tank directly in front of the cockpit, giving him the necessary range and providing a crucial safety barrier between him and the engine in a crash, Lindbergh had eliminated the forward visibility entirely. His forward visibility was limited to a tiny periscope and a side window, forcing him to fly for 33 hours virtually blind to what was directly ahead. It was an audacious, almost suicidal compromise, born from a desperate need to save every possible ounce of weight. As he checked his fuel lines one last time, the rain-soaked runway looked less like a launch pad and more like a mud-slicked death trap. The plane was dangerously overloaded, with over 450 gallons of gasoline, weighing close to 5,100 pounds. To get that much weight off the ground required a perfect combination of skill and pure blind luck. He climbed into the cockpit, a cramped, cold metal box. He had no radio to communicate with the world, no navigator, and no co-pilot. His only companions were a few emergency rations, a cheap inflatable raft, a sextant for celestial navigation, and the terrifying, relentless roar of the right whirlwind engine. At 7:52 a.m., the ground crew pulled the wheel chocks. Lindbergh pushed the throttle forward. The tail of the Spirit lifted almost instantly, but the main wheels remained stubbornly glued to the muddy track. The plane lumbered, rattling and shaking, gathering speed with agonizing slowness. He wrestled the controls, fighting the crosswinds and the massive inertia. Every foot of the runway rushed past, a critical distance that meant the difference between fame and a fiery grave. He missed the first set of high-tension wires at the runway's end by mere feet. The plane finally lifted, skimming the trees and rooftops before climbing slowly into the gray, drizzling sky. He was airborne, on his own, with enough fuel to reach a continent he'd never seen and no way to turn back. He had calculated the flight to the minute. He knew that if the engine faltered for even an hour, or if he drifted off course by a fraction of a degree, he would vanish forever into the endless, hungry maw of the Atlantic Ocean. The first few hours over New England and the Canadian Maritimes was a battle against turbulence and a rising dread. He had not slept in over 24 hours, meticulously supervising the loading and preparation of the plane, knowing that any mistake was his last. As he cleared the coast of Newfoundland and left the last sliver of land behind, the true enormity of his isolation set in. Below him, the sea was a churning slate gray, the waves capped with white foam that seemed to mock the impossible task he had undertaken. The clock began to tick, a 33-hour countdown to glory or oblivion. Lindbergh's challenge was not just mechanical, it was fundamentally human. The greatest danger wasn't the engine or the weather, it was sleep. To fall asleep meant death. The roar of the engine was a constant, mind-numbing drone. Hours passed, and the sun dipped, coating the ocean in an unsettling, oily black. By midnight, he was flying completely on instruments through thick, swirling fog. Ice began to form on the wings, a shimmering, deadly layer that threatened to pull the spirit of St. Louis down to the waves. Lindbergh had to drop to within 10 feet of the surface, skimming the terrifying whitecaps to find warmer air, until he felt the wings shed their icy coat, only to climb back into the blinding mist. The lack of sleep became a physical force. His eyelids felt like lead weights. He started doing mental exercises, reciting poetry, and pinching his arms. But by the 20th hour, the hallucinations began. It wasn't just shadows. It was the feeling that he was no longer alone in the cockpit. He saw misty, ghost-like figures, translucent forms that hovered around him, speaking in low, indistinct murmurs. They were friendly, he felt, and seemed to understand his plight. They discussed navigation with him, pointing out features in the fog. He knew rationally that they weren't real, but their presence was so vivid, so calming, that for a time he surrendered to the shared illusion. This lasted for hours, a surreal conversation with the dead, the ghosts of the great ocean acting as his co-pilots through the dark. He wondered if this was what madness felt like, or if the sheer exhaustion had opened a door to something ancient and deep within the soul of the sea. Then, through a sudden break in the clouds, at hour 27, a sight shattered the delirium and brought him violently back to reality. It was a small, three-masted fishing vessel directly beneath him. He was over the ocean, yes, but no fishing boat should be this far west. He dove low and shouted, the wind whipping his words away, trying to get the fisherman's attention. Finally, a lone figure looked up. Lindbergh banked the plane, circled, and pointed furiously to the east and yelled the most urgent question he could think of. "Which way is Ireland?" The fisherman simply stared, bewildered, and pointed forward. Lindbergh had found the shipping lanes. He was near the coast. The realization, the sudden, sharp, glorious shock of nearing land was better than any stimulant. The hallucinations vanished instantly, replaced by a surge of pure, desperate hope. He steered toward the rising sun, now fully alert, his eyes burning but clear. Just a few hours later, a dark smudge appeared on the horizon. It grew rapidly into a definite shape, a rolling green coastline he knew from his charts, the southwest tip of Ireland. He had made landfall. He was alive. The exhaustion, however, had one more trick to play. The full story would continue, detailing his navigation across Britain, his near-fatal error over the English Channel, the final approach to Paris, and the unbelievable violent frenzy of the crowd that greeted him at Le Bourget Field, a moment of instant global fame that would lead to a life of unimaginable triumph and, eventually, unspeakable tragedy.